How's everyone doing today? Okay, so what we're going to go through with this chapter is we're going to take our programs that we developed during chapter two. Chapter two, we just developed the GUIs. We didn't do any code. This chapter, we're going to be adding some code to our applications and make them fully functional. So the title of it is Program Design and Coding. So we've done most of the design, but we're going to be adding a little bit more functionality with hiding buttons and displaying buttons, and then making them fully functional while adding code in. Also adding comments, which is something that's very important for yourself and for other developers. We'll talk more about that later. So some of the overarching objectives of this chapter, we're going to learn how to change the color properties of an object. We've done a little bit of that with the labels and the demos I walked through, but we'll dig into that a little more. We will add images to our picture box object. Some of you have started playing around with this during chapter two, but we'll do a little more with this and we'll show you how to add images the proper way to a picture box object. Talk a little bit about locating and saving images. Some of the applications in this chapter, they will provide images for you. Some of them you may have to go out to the internet and find some images. So if you don't know how to do that, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about importing an image into the program resources folder, and that's very important. And we'll talk a little bit about why later. There's two ways to import an image. Talk about sizing images. And we'll talk about two more properties will be introduced in this chapter. The visible property and enabled property. We'll talk about running and compiling your programs, and then we'll start entering code in our programs. We'll talk about the dot notation, which is the code statement format for Visual Studio, and most programming languages use some type of dot notation. We'll talk about Intellisense and how that can help you as you're coding. So we'll use code to set our visible property or enabled property. We've been setting properties all along using the properties window in the lower right-hand corner of Visual Studio, but you can also set those properties with code, and that's what we'll be doing with a lot of our properties in this chapter. We'll talk about adding comments in our code, correcting errors, and using the built-in close procedure to exit out of our program properly and clear out all the memory. So while users and others can approve mockups as being functional, the developer is normally the one that makes a variety of changes to the user interface or prepare it for the actual production version of the program. So someone, when you're working on a program, is going to give you specifications, but it's going to be your job to interpret those specifications and write the program. So adding color to the interface will make it more visually appealing. Sometimes you'll be given images for programs, and sometimes you have to acquire images. Sometimes, if you're creative, you can create your own images, graphics, or a lot of times you might have a internal art department that does that for you. But some people are creative and they create their own images. And we'll talk about setting interface object properties according to the needs of the program. So it's going to be your job to look at the specifications, interpret those, and interpret what your thoughts of what the program should do into code. So the back color of an object is the color displayed in its background. To set the back color of an object by using the back color property in the properties window. I think we did a little bit of this for those of you that are in class with the labels. The forecolor of an object is the color displayed in the text of the object. So that's really the text color. I always thought that was a little confusing that they don't call it text color, they call it forecolor, just the way it's done. So in this example, the back color of the form was changed to white from the default gray. So picture box objects are used to display a graphic image. The general steps for displaying an image in a picture box are as follows. So first you want to locate the image to display it in the picture box. So if you don't have an image, you might find it in the web, and you're going to need to save that image somewhere locally, either on your hard drive or your flash drive. somewhere where you can open it up and import it into your project. So you always want to import images into the resources folder of your program. There's when you're importing images, there's two ways to access them. You can do a local resource or a program resource. A local resource means your program is going to point to a file somewhere on the computer or somewhere on the network drive. That's fine in some cases. The problem is if you're writing a program on your laptop and you use a local resource, and that local resource is located, that image is located on your laptop, and then you take that program itself and bring it into school and try to run that program, that resource is no longer there because you don't have your laptop local. So that program will error and crash on you. So you always want to import the images into your program, and I'll explain that in the next screen. So what you're going to want to change, I'll go back one screen, to import your images is you're going to want to go to the picture box and scroll down until you find the image property. Once you find that image property, there's a little button next to the property, and that'll bring up a dialog where you can select the import button and select a resource. That'll allow you to import that image into your picture box. Okay, and once you've done that, in this example here, you'll see the image displayed in your Solution Explorer. Okay, you might notice that when you import your images, they look a little weird. If you look at the images before you import them, you might only get a corner of the image because the image is larger than what your picture box is. And on the next screen, we talk about that. So there's a size mode property of the picture box as well. If you change that size mode property of the picture box to stretch image, it will scale that image up or down to fit the picture box. So you got to be careful about that. So in this example, the picture itself is pretty square, and the picture is square, and the picture box is square as well. If the picture was square and you made your picture box short and narrow, it would kind of squish and stretch that picture down. So you want to think about the aspect ratio and how you're sizing your picture boxes. You've designed all these GUIs without really knowing what your pictures look like. So as you're going through and adding code and adding images to your GUIs that you developed in the last chapter, you might have to change your interfaces a little bit if things don't look right. And that's fine, that happens. So size mode and stretch image will stretch the image to fit up and down in the picture box. So the next thing we're going to learn about a little bit in this chapter is the visible property. So the visible property does just that. It makes an object visible or invisible. So just like the other properties, you can go to the properties window, whatever the object is, you select the visible property to true or false. Default is true. If you set it to false, when you run the program, that object will no longer be visible. Okay, so if I set the visible property here of my picture box, nothing will happen until I actually run the program. It wouldn't make a lot of sense to make something invisible in design mode, then you couldn't see it anymore and you wouldn't know it was there. So if you make something, if you make the visible property false in design mode, nothing will happen. You won't see it occur until you run the program. The other property we'll be dealing with is the enable property. So what the enable property does for us is it doesn't really apply to picture boxes. It applies to objects that have a function, like a button or a text box. So say you have an exit button text box, and you don't want users to exit out of the screen until they've done something. So what you can do is you can set the enable property of that button or something to false, so that the user doesn't click on it and exit out of the program until they do something else, okay? What it'll do, usually it changes the appearance a little bit, so it'll gray the button out. And if the user clicks on it, nothing happens while it's enabled until the user performs some function to, while it's disabled, nothing will happen until the user does something to re-enable that object. So in this example, the latte, what we want to happen is initially we want the select latte to be disabled because we don't want them to do anything, to select anything until they select one of the pumpkin spice or mocha buttons. So they'll select pumpkin spice or mocha. Once they do that, then the select latte will become enabled and you can click it to make your selection. Very simple stuff, but just the way it works. So this is the enable property. You'll initially set it to false, so that select latte button is not enabled initially. So once you've done all those things and you want to see what happens when you've made your picture boxes not visible, the only way to do that is to run the program. And most of you have seen what happens when you run the program. So when we get to the guided program walkthrough, I'll have you do that just to show you what happens. It's a good idea as you're going through and coding your program. Every time you make a fairly major coding change, run the program just to make sure it's working. Don't wait till the end until you're done all your coding, because then you may have 5 or 6 errors to fix. Run your code every time you make a major change just to make sure things are running. And to run the program, you just click on the little start button with a little arrow on it. That'll compile it, it'll look for errors, and it'll run your program for you. So when you run this program, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be making the 2 picture boxes visible property equal false to make them invisible, and then you're going to make the select latte property enabled equal to false. So you can see how it's a little grayed out, so if you click on it, nothing happens. If the user clicks on pumpkin spice, the pumpkin spice picture gets displayed, and the select latte will be enabled, and then the user can click back and forth. And once they've clicked on one of these, the select latte button becomes enabled, so you can click on it and then it just displays one of these. So now we're going to talk about entering code. When you enter code in the event handler that handles the event that the user action triggers by executing code that performs the required processing. With Visual Studio and the desired program open and design tab window visible, point to the desired button object in the Windows form object and double click on the button object. So some of you might have done this accidentally while you're doing your GUI layouts. If you accidentally clicked on the button, a screen popped up with code on it. You didn't really know what it was. What you had brought up was the event handler for the form or the button, okay? And that's where you're going to enter your code. So if I double click on my button pumpkin, I am going to get this event handler. So what you'll see is your public class for your form, and then within the form, your sub procedure for the button pumpkin click. This is your event handler. When you enter code for this, the code needs to be between this private sub and this end sub. As your programs get more complicated, you're going to have multiple subs for different buttons or different things that you're doing within your program. You just want to make sure when you're entering code that applies to the proper button. Okay, so you would enter your code for the button click between the sub and the end sub. You got to be careful that you don't delete this end sub or any of the code here, because this is all important. If you delete the end sub, then you'll get an error in your code and it won't compile. So when we're entering our code statements, we have to use a specific syntax. This syntax is sometimes called dot notation. So when we click on the button, for pumpkin, we want to make that pumpkin picture box visible. So what we will type is our object name, pick pumpkin, dot, so this is our dot notation, and then our property, which is visible, and then we set the property equal to true. So very similar to what we did in the properties window, where you set the visible property of the pumpkin, pick pumpkin object to true. This is just doing that in code when we click on the button. Okay, so it's object name dot property equal true. So that's going to just set the picture box for the pumpkin visible property to true for you. A couple other examples of that dot notation. So it's just another picture box setting the deep dish peach of it property visible equal to true, and then setting the button's enabled property equal to false. And that would dim the button and allow the user not to click on it. So Intellisense is going to be your friend. Intellisense displays all allowable entries you can make in Visual Basic Statement each time a dot or equal sign or other special character is required for the statement. So while you're typing, when you're in code, if you type PIC, you're going to get a little dialogue in that code window that's going to list all the objects in your program that start with PIC. So if you have two picture boxes, it's going to list those two picture boxes. And then rather than typing out the whole name and misspelling it accidentally, you can just select it and hit tab. And then after you've typed that, you'll type the dot and then V, and it will list all the properties that start with a V. And you can just select the one that you want, hit tab, and go on. And then you're going to hit equal, and then you hit T, and it'll display all the possible values that start with a T. For this example, you can only set visible property to true or false, so you don't have to type in the whole word T, true. You just hit T and tab, and it'll type that for you. So this can help you eliminate a lot of the coding errors, especially if you're not a great speller. This will help you a lot using Intellisense. And some students don't like to use it, but I'm going to encourage you to all use it when you're writing code. So the other thing we're going to do in this chapter is we're going to start entering comments in our code. Comments are used for a couple of reasons. First, as a developer, for yourself, it's a good idea sometimes before you start coding to do some pseudocode and kind of think through the steps that you're going to be doing. So you might want to, before you start coding, just write out a quick blurb for yourself of what you want to do in this program. So in case you need to go back to it or you're not completely sure what you need to do, you have a little blurb for yourself of what that particular part of the program might do. It's also a good idea to have comments in there if someone else is going to be modifying your code someday. And a lot of times when you're working at a company, you'll develop a program and then you might maintain it later on, or someone else might maintain it. So when that person is going back and debugging your code or adding something to it, it's a good idea to have comments in there to explain what that code is doing. Or maybe you did something a certain way and it's not the typical way you would do things. Put that in your code so whoever's looking at your code realizes it. Sometimes people put like kind of funny things in their comments just to kind of make other developers laugh. I used to work with a guy and I always enjoyed looking at his code because he put little silly things in his code, kind of inside private jokes. No one sees it except the other developers, but it's just kind of a fun thing sometimes. You gotta be careful, make sure you don't put anything inappropriate in there. And you don't want to put too much of that in there because that can lead to program bloat. Every line of code you put in a program makes that code base larger and larger. So you don't want to get too crazy with it. But, you know, a couple of little funny things here and there isn't going to hurt anybody. No Easter eggs yet, but a couple little things in comments don't hurt anybody. So, to put a comment in, what you're going to use is the apostrophe. A lot of programming languages use slashes for comments. In Visual Basic, it's the apostrophe. So I guess that is the, trying to find the apostrophe on my keyboard. Right next to the enter key is the apostrophe. So in this example, you see these first two lines here are in green. Green denotes those are comments. So you start the line with an apostrophe, okay? And then if everything after it is green, that means those are comments. And so comments just mean when the program is compiled, the compiler skips over those lines. So it's not going to try to compile those lines because they're just not going to make them part of the program because they're just comments to the developers. It's still going to be in the code, but it won't be part of the machine code that gets compiled down. I'll talk a little bit about this in my program walkthrough, but in this book, they use some really wordy comments. Every comment is, this code is executed when the user clicks the whatever button and blah, 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 blah. You don't need comments that wordy. You know, this code is executed when the user clicks the blah. No, you don't need that. All you really want to do is explain what happens. So pumpkin picture box, visible set to false, picture box whatever set to false, and then this set to true. So you don't need to write a paragraph for your comments. Make them quick, make them simple. So this is an example of a couple ways you can do comments. You can do inline comments. So anything you do after the apostrophe, you can't do the comment at the beginning of the line, but if you do it at the end of the line, you can do inline comments, or they call it same line comments. I don't like these because it only really works when you have a short line of code. Sometimes you're going to have longer lines of code, and the comments will be off the screen, and you don't want the user or the other developers having to scroll to find your comment. So I like to do my comments above wherever the code is. Don't do your comments below the code. I had a student a few years ago that would always put his comments below the code, and I tried to explain to him that's not the way developers do it. And he said, well, I like to do it that way. So, well, you're kind of doing things different than you should be doing. And if you go to a company, they're not going to like that. And eventually he came around. But comments above the code, so the user can, or the developer who's looking at your code, can quickly look at the comments, see what it does. If they're debugging it, it'll make them easier for them to find code. Usually your code is going to be a lot more complicated than this, so the comments can really help another developer when you're looking through and debugging the code. Some developers don't like to do comments. When I'm hiring a developer, when I'm interviewing a developer and I'm looking at their code, the first thing I'm looking for is quality comments that describe what the program is doing and why you're doing things the way you're doing them. Sometimes there's a good way to do things and a bad way to do things. Sometimes you have to do things not the best way, and there's a good reason for that. If you identify that in the comments, then that's fine. So the other thing we want to do in all our programs is introductory comments. So we want to comment our individual sections of our code, but we also want to have at the top of our program, like say you're writing a paper for English class, you usually have your name at the top and a title in the class. You want to do the same thing with your code. So you're going to have the program name, you're going to have your name in it, you're going to have the date that the program was created, and you're going to have maybe the purpose of the program. If you were writing something for a company, you would have all those things, and you might also have a revision section. So if you're modifying someone else's code, you want to put a comment in there that, you know, who revised it, that you were revising it, and you revised it on this date, and this is why you were revising it. Just so that if someone goes back into that code later, they can see all the changes that have been made to the code. Just makes it a lot easier for them. So your introductory comments are always going to go at the top of the program above the public class. So you can see here they've started it apostrophe program name column, and this is the latte selection, and you put developer name, you put your name, you put the date, and you put the purpose of the program. Very, very important. That's something I'm going to be grading you on, having those comments in every single one of your programs. So correcting errors. As you're going through encoding this, you will probably make some errors. Intellisense will, so using Intellisense should help you to reduce errors. But if you do have some errors, they will sometimes appear as you're coding. So in Microsoft Word, when you spell something wrong, or in Google Docs when you spell something wrong, sometimes you'll see a little squiggly under a word. That tells you spelled it wrong. Visual Studio will do the same thing. If you see a little squiggly under your code, that means you've typed something wrong and you need to correct it. And that's usually a build error. So in this example, a user was typing in comments and they forgot to put the apostrophe. So this is trying to be interpreted as a line of code. It's not. It should be a comment. So when the user went to, you can see the red squiggly, but the user decided to try to run the program and they get a build error. So if you see this error, you don't want to continue and try to run the code because it's going to cause some errors. You want to hit no and you want to correct that error. So all you would do is go in and put an apostrophe in there, and that would fix this error for you. When we get into the later chapters, you will find that this debugger here will help you fix some of the more advanced errors. This one, there's not really much it can do to figure out, but if you're putting in loop statements or if then else statements, sometimes it'll give you a suggestion and it'll do a good job of fixing things for you. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's not sure what you're doing. It'll fix it wrong. But most of the time it does a pretty good job. So they're just describing in this slide how to fix that comment. Just put an apostrophe in. So you put the apostrophe in, converts that to a comment, and you're good to go. The error goes away. You can run your program. So in this program, the other additional event handler we're going to do is for the exit button. So you're going to have an exit button. You're going to double click on that, and then it's going to bring up the button exit.click event. Okay. And then you're going to enter comments for that. So for this one, this is an example of where I think this book goes wrong. So this code is executed when the user clicks the exit button. It closes the window and terminates the program execution. Please don't type this. Just all your comment needs to be is exits the program. That's all I want to see for these comments. You don't need to write a paragraph. For the code itself is close. So your comment should be close the program or exit the program. You don't need to write a paragraph. So in that button exit event handler, all you have to type is close. You don't actually even have to type these parentheses. This close is a procedure call. It's a built-in procedure that will close the program for you and clear out all the memory. All you have to do is type close and it'll put those parentheses in for you. But what you're doing is you're calling a built-in procedure. It does a whole bunch of other stuff when it closes a program so that you don't have any memory leaks or anything like that. So you see this example, you see their crazy comments, which you don't need. You're just going to put close the program. I do want to see comments on all your event handlers in each of your buttons, but they don't have to be as wordy as the book asks you to do. You can print your code out as well if you want to. I will never ask you to print your code. Trying to be as environmentally friendly as possible. But it is possible to print your code if you have a printer and you want to look at it. That's fine. So writing code is the essence of programming Visual Basic. That we're going to be doing a lot of coding this year. much of the emphasis in this book will be on writing the code required to implement applications for all kinds. So this is what we're going to be doing in this chapter. We're going to be doing a lot of coding. These initial cases in this chapter are very, very simple. All we're really going to be doing is hiding picture boxes and making them visible and invisible and enabling buttons. But as we get to the next couple chapters, it'll get a little bit more complicated. So don't feel like this is too easy. I promise you it'll get harder as we go along. So we talked a little bit in the last chapter of the phases of the system development lifecycle. So we had interpret the specifications, design the program, and now we're in phase 4, coding the program. So after the events and tasks, then the events have been identified, the developer is ready to code the program, developers enter the code and implement the logic. So after we code it, then we test it, then we move into production. So in this chapter, you've learned how to fine-tune a user interface to maximize its usefulness and enter code for object event handlers. So the next thing you should do after this presentation is watch my guided program walkthrough, where I'll go through adding all the code and all the specifications to the latte selection application. Thanks a lot, guys.